Yes, thank you very much. And I said good morning, but of course I should say good afternoon, everyone in Japan. It's been a while that I visited your beautiful country, and I hope to do it again soon. So thank you very much for this invitation and the opportunity to speak with you today. So what I want to do is explain you the mission of STM in improving research integrity, and the way we do that by means of collaboration and increasingly by means of technology. But I will start with saying something about STM, and Anders already gave a good introduction about what STM does. But maybe to stress here is that it's our mission to advance trusted research. You can see that in the motto, in the logo. And we do that really by two means: by developing standards, standards in transparency, standards in quality, but also increasingly by means of technology. Our activities have actually accelerated. So I have joined STM as Director of Research Integrity from this year onwards, as a testimony to our focus and our dedication to improve trusted research, which is so important in today's society. Before I talk about what we do, I first wanted to talk a bit about what the causes are for us to worry about research integrity, because it's actually a wide term that collects different developments and different threats. So I just wanted to go through the four main reasons why research integrity is threatened today. And the first cause, of course, is career advancement. That is, I would say, the traditional threat to research integrity. In today's society, in today's scientific society, scientists are still rewarded by means of the number of publications and the number of citations, which causes sometimes misbehavior, fraud in papers, plagiarism, etc. This is a screenshot from the website retractionwatch.org, which is very interesting, which kind of follows the retractions of articles and also shows exactly what went wrong at certain publications. And I would say this is more the traditional kind of misconduct we think of research integrity, but actually there are more reasons why integrity is threatened. What we see also increasingly, and which has very much to do with research integrity, is censorship. When countries start to be uncomfortable about certain publications, or certain measures or policies are being questioned, and the governments try to suppress research. This is, of course, very important as well. Research integrity also means independence, and independence from governments. And that's something we have to be very conscious about as well. For science to progress, for science to be valuable, it has to be independent from government, and sometimes be able to tell inconvenient truth to them. Another important threat that we experience at STM and at publishers frequently is the commercial interest, which can play a role, and this can take different forms. To the right, you see an image which depicts the predatory journals, basically journals that are just launched only to make money from open access fees. And this is one of the unintended consequences of the open access policy, is that it's relatively easy to set up a journal to pretend to be genuine, but then basically only exist to get open access fees and not provide any services to the authors in terms of peer review or in terms of editorial process. But there are more elements to that. For example, there is the relatively new phenomenon of paper mills. And in case you're not aware of them, paper mills are basically companies or individuals that sell authorship. So they create a paper, often plagiarized, often, and in many cases, fake science, fake images, they try to publish it and then they sell the authorship. It also sometimes takes the form of peer review rings, whereby fake peer reviewers are suggested by the author so that the article gets accepted. So this is for STM actually a big concern. The paper mills, they're very professional. They make use of technology and in a very sophisticated way. We really have to stop it because it's bad for science, but it's also bad for the publishers. Last but not least, there is also another threat that is relatively new, and that is the influence of politics and ideology. And I just want to say a few words about it. Science has become very politicized. Think about COVID. Think about the important impact of politics and ideology, the woke ideology. And when you think about independence, it also means that scientists should be able to express their thoughts and publish their results without that influence. And it's also something we have to be aware of, that sometimes science publishes things that are inconvenient, that are not modish or not very popular. And especially with COVID, we've seen that in a very politicized, in a very tense environment, let's make sure that all views are allowed to be expressed and discussed. Again, elementary for science to progress. So, research integrity, what I wanted to say with this, it is quite complex. It has different causes. And it basically suffers from a lot of the challenges we have as society as a whole. So tackling this is quite a complex task that not only publishers, but that everybody in the scholarly ecosystem should be working on. And again, it's not just the task of researchers. It is also not just the task of the publishers, but it's the task of the institutes. It's the task of governments. When you think about the pressure to suppress certain results, for example, and it's also the task of the funders. So it's a challenge that affects the entire ecosystem. Now, to make things even more complex, I wanted to spend a few words talking about publishing, because publishing has become very complex as well. This is the way publishing looked like when I started my career at the end of the 90s. This was basically how information was communicated by means of journals and by means of books, and the process was pretty much straightforward. And now the environment looks a bit like this. Now I have to explain this picture a bit. Every year at STM, we have a brainstorm with a group of people from within and outside of publishing, looking at our ecosystem and seeing how it changes, and making a prediction for the next 5 years on what the trends are. And this is what we came up with this year. This is a river delta landscape, and we use it to kind of explain how complex our ecosystem has become in the last 20 years with the advent of internet and other types of technology. So this is, when you zoom into the picture, this is how it used to be. So papers would flow into peer review, and then after being reviewed and accepted, it would flow into the river delta as trusted research material. But that has become very complex as well. Just to give you a few examples, and you can find the entire presentation on the STM website. We have now preprint servers, something we're going to talk about further today as well. Preprint servers are not reviewed. The advantage, of course, is that it's a much faster way to communicate results. And we've seen in the COVID period that it has a lot of advantages. But again, not being reviewed is making the ecosystem slightly more complex. Another thing, and again, we unfortunately don't have time to go through this entire landscape, because that would take actually an entire presentation. But think about data, how important data has become. And it's also something I will tell a bit about it later in the presentation, data is increasingly important. But when you think about research integrity, that very much relates to data as well. How do we make sure that data is of high quality? How do we make sure that data is shared, etc.? So things have become more complex. Research integrity is a complex topic and a sensitive topic, but also publishing is more complicated. So, as I mentioned, research integrity is the responsibility of everyone, of the publishers, of the funders, the governments, but the publications, the publishers, our focus on integrity is really on the integrity of the publication process. And what does that mean? That the process has to be transparent, that it has to be predictable for the authors, but also for the readers, that it has to be done responsible. There has to be accountability in terms of if things go wrong. We have to check some provenance. So this is just some of the lists that the publishers are responsible for. And again, to stress, yes, the publishers bear a big responsibility, but it's a wider topic than just what the publishers should and can do in our ecosystem. Now let's talk about STM. So in the first slide, I talked about STM's mission, and just to repeat it, it is to support our members to advance trusted research. And we do that by developing standards and technology, by supporting research integrity, but also in general, the quality, the transparency, and an open science. And I want to explain you what we do and how we advance this mission by looking at the different levels of the different types of content that are published. And traditionally, of course, we have the language, and that's, let's say, the more traditional way to communicate scientific results. And here we have already, as a community, made big progress. Most publishers now make use of plagiarism checks, making use of software like Authenticate, which means that it's now quite difficult to publish something with plagiarized content. And of course, here also technology plays a very important role. These tools making use of sophisticated AI tools to really check for the language and make sure that it's original and authentic. When you talk about the next level is images, and here things become more complicated because the checking images for manipulation, for duplication is very, very complex. If you read retractionwatch.org, or if you follow the news, you know there are some very famous individuals who have a very special gift to check these kind of image manipulations, but it's very difficult. And there are two things important here. First, how do we detect image manipulation? And second, what do we do? So how do we handle image alterations and duplications? And again, they don't always have to be an indication of fraud and manipulation, but sometimes they are. So concerning the recommendations, STM has a working group, and I'm part of that working group, and we have developed guidelines and recommendations for editors to handle integrity issues. So when a scientific editor, a journal editor, finds an issue or finds an image that is suspect, we have first of all made a categorization of what kinds of malfunctions there are, and some of them are serious, some of them not serious, but also giving a recommendation on what to do, talking to the author, or even in case of a real fraud is going to the institute. We held a webinar earlier this year in September, and it's available on the STM website. We invited people for comments, and we received a lot of comments on that, and we are going to process these. And in December the 7th, on the STM conference, we are going to present the latest version, the final version of the recommendations. But handling them is one thing, again, detection is another, and I will talk about our future plans to offer more sophisticated ways for editors and journals to detect this later on. So when you move from language to images to data, things are gonna get more complex. And data, as I showed on the early image, is one of the emerging new types of content that we see alongside the preprints, as I showed in just a few slides before. And the first responsibility of publishers is to ensure that underlying research data is shared and cited and linked to publications. And of course, in itself, that is extremely important for research integrity. Having the data, having the underlying data, and for people to check that data when they read an article is just an elementary way to ensure that research is properly done, that the claims made in the article are supported by the data, and that the research can be made reproducibility, one of the pillars of good science. So for this reason, we have created a program, and I will explain you a bit more about that in the next slides. But important to mention here is that checking research data for integrity is really the next frontier. So checking images is complex, but checking data, ensuring that it's sound, that it's good data, that it's not falsified data, is really very important. That can only be done by technology. There are some unique individuals who can check images for duplication, but checking the data is really even more complex. So again, just to stress the importance of technology in research integrity. I wanted to do next is go through three specific projects that we have done. And then after that, I want to talk about a larger project, which we will start next year, addressing some of the challenges that I've just mentioned. First is the research data year, which we initiated in 2020. Again, research data is extremely important for research integrity. And for that reason, it is extremely important that publishers roll out tools that help authors to share the data. So ensuring that the data underlying the research is made available alongside the article, that it's linked to in a proper way, and that it's cited. And the goal here is to really make research data one of those emerging new types of content, a solid and available content alongside the article. And publishers have made actually some very good successes here. So like 10 years ago, some publishers started to make the data available, made it linkable. And inspired by the success, STM organized the Research Data Year. And the goal here is really to ensure that as many publishers as possible have made data available, so that all the researchers that publish their results, that submit their results, are encouraged and sometimes made mandatory to make that data available in the proper way. Now, there are three things important here when you think about making research data available in articles. One is that the journal has to have a journal policy. And a journal policy is basically, again, a policy describing to the authors in what cases and how the data should be made available when they publish. A second element important is, you see that the top left is a data availability statement. And a data availability statement is basically a piece of text in the article explaining the reader whether data is available and if so, how. And the third important is Scholex. And Scholex is basically a system that allows authors to submit their links, and those links are then processed in such a way that the link to the research data is always available and also measurable. So basically, it creates a net, a web of information whereby the article is always linked to the data and vice versa. So if you read an article, you can always click to the data, and when you're at the data, you can click back to the article. So in this research data year, we did our best to increase those numbers. We work with over 20 publishers. You can see them on the top right. They were part of the program. And as you can see, they are the very large ones and the very small ones, the commercial ones, the non-commercial ones. And we started encouraging them to roll out policies, to include availability statements, and to connect to colleagues. We do this by means of workshops, by means of giving them support, but also working with a lot of other institutions in the scholarly ecosystem, because research integrity and data specifically, encouraging the sharing of that is not something, again, we can do alone as publishers, but we have to do that with funders, we have to do that with institutions, we have to do that, of course, with data repositories. So it is something where collaboration is extremely important. Now you can see some of the results. So we increased the number of policies. There are more data availability statements. We doubled that number in 1 year, and for that reason, we actually continued the program. So now the research data year became the research data program, and we're still working with publishers to increase the uptake of all of these. The second project I want to talk about is peer review, and this is very much related to open science and to transparent science. And so one of the reasons we did this is to make sure that that it's very transparent to authors, but also to readers when they read an article, is what kind of peer review process was used here. And again, thinking back about the earlier image I showed, the world has become very complex. There are preprint surveys, there are journals, but also review itself changed. And I'm sure you all heard of the term open peer review, which is something that emerged about 15 years ago and became quite popular. But the problem is that open review can mean very different things. And actually, there was research that collected all the different types of review, that used the term open review. And actually, there are 122 different forms of review that are all called open peer review. So that is not a term that is very clear anymore. So with this project, we wanted to do two things. First of all the journals and all the articles will always mention what kind of peer review is being used. So being very transparent about the process, but also making sure we have the language to describe all the different review models that are being used, so that the reader and the author are immediately clear, this article or this journal uses this particular model. So we developed a peer review terminology, which you can see here. And basically it describes the peer review process according to 4 different categories. The first one is what we call identity transparency. And it basically means who sees what, who sees who during the peer review process. And I'm sure you know the term single blind, double blind, even triple blind, or just open. And this is what we captured by all identities visible. That means that if you submit your article, the author will know who the reviewer is, the reviewer will know who the author is, and also the editor. Everybody knows the editor, and the editor sees everyone. And then we have single anonymized, double anonymized, and triple anonymized. The second one is who the reviewer interacts with. One of the new models we've seen in the last years is the so-called collaborative peer review, is whereby if you submit a manuscript, it's not just a reviewer looking at it and saying yes or no, or accept with modifications, but actually the author and the reviewer will actually work together to improve the manuscript. So this is something that is captured by that second category. The third one is what information is published. Open review can also mean that if you read an article, you can see who the reviewers were for that particular article, or you can see what the original submitted manuscript was, or you can see the correspondence between the editor and the author. And this is captured by the third category. And then the fourth category is describing whether there is what we used to call post-publication review, basically that you can see a discussion about the paper alongside the article after publication. And in order to prevent confusion, we call it now post-publication commenting to distinguish it from the review process. So how does that look like? You can see to the right 2 examples. So a traditional model, a traditional peer review, you would describe it by means of the following way: the identity transparency, single anonymized. So you used to call single blind, it's now called single anonymized. The reviewer interacts with the editor and there is no information published alongside the article. Example B is a more complex or a more innovative review model whereby all identities are visible. So it's an open review model in terms of who sees who during the process. There is interaction, so there's collaborative peer review, and the review reports and the reviewer identities are published alongside the article, and there is post-publication commenting. So this is how we want all the journals and all the articles to describe the peer review process. Again, in light of the complexity of our ecosystem and the evolution of our ecosystem, that we still maintain the transparency of the review process, which is so extremely important still for the scholarly ecosystem. Where are we here? We finalized a pilot, a successful pilot with 10 publishers this year. And now we are working together with NISO to make sure this becomes a standard in the whole scholarly ecosystem. So that it is at the moment in process, and hopefully next year this will become a standard, a NISO standard. NISO, in case you know, it's an American institute that creates this kind of standards. And then we want to ensure that 99% or 98% of all the journals will use this standard in the coming years, making, again, the ecosystem more transparent for everyone. So the last thing I want to say, that the 3 examples of the projects we do at STM is around AI. And when you think about technology, and I will devote the last slides talking about a bit more, when you think about the tools we have to detect fraud and manipulation. So think about language checking, think about images checking, screening, or think about data screening. AI plays an important role. Everybody talks about AI, and we also talk about AI, because actually, when you think about science and when you think about publishing in particular, AI is very relevant, and we already do a lot with AI. There are actually 3 areas where publishers are involved, at least 3 areas. We provide the data. Of course, AI works on data, and who is better able to provide trusted data, check data, review data than the publishers. And we use AI for internal workflows and services. So, for example, checking for language, or again, checking for screening for fraud and manipulation. But also some of the publishers are creating external facing tools and services based on AI. Now, AI is a fantastic tool and it's a very promising tool, but it's also a tool that has risks. We all know the examples where discrimination happens because of AI. There's misuse of AI. So in order to ensure that we apply AI responsibly, we have developed best practice principles, and we have done that by means of a white paper, which is freely available. And there's a link here, and you can also find it on the STM website. Basically describing how best to create So the best practice guidelines to ensure that whenever we use AI, and we do that, and we have to do that increasingly, so also in light of research integrity, that we do that in a good and a responsible way. Of course, we have to make sure that privacy is ensured, that we are transparent about when we use AI. We have to be accountable if things go wrong. And maybe to just stress one important element here is fairness. AI basically works by means of looking at the past and predicting the future based on that. And that is potentially quite risky because, of course, science and innovation in science happens by means of new ideas and new thoughts, totally new way of looking at things. And AI works in a kind of conservative way because it looks at the past. Again, it looks at certain areas that were successful, or certain people in certain regions that were successful, or certain terms that kind of predict success in terms of impact. And the risk of AI, and you can read more about it in the paper, is that it suppresses the new ideas, the innovative ideas. So that's one of the responsibilities we feel as a publisher. Yes, let's use AI, but let's make sure it doesn't basically suppress innovation and creativity, such an important element for science and innovation in science.
Boris, you have 3 minutes left.
Yes, and I'm coming to my last slide actually, and that is actually something we're working on for the future. I talked a lot about technology. Technology is key. We can't think about research integrity and checking and screening without technology. Also because our let's say adversaries are using technology. You might use. Probably you heard of the paper mill. I mentioned briefly about that in the beginning of the presentation. They're using high tech and to basically to falsify papers, falsify images. So we have to basically, we're in a kind of an arms race to make sure that our technology is better to check what they're doing. So we have to use technology, but also do that in a collaborative way. We have to basically bundle our forces and make sure that we are again having the best tools to check on that. But it's also, so we have to collaborate. Publishers are willing to do it. We are basically able to work together, but it's also difficult. If you, for example, you have a paper and it's falsified and you publish it, you submit it to one journal and it basically tells the author, well, it's actually falsified. Sometimes what happens is the author goes to another journal. And of course, there are, different things that play a role here. However, we have to work together. And for that reason, we started a new project. It's called the Research Integrity Collaboration Hub, which we are about to launch. So this is like a pre-announcement. But what we're thinking of building, and then I want to leave you with that idea, and hopefully next year I can talk to you more about the progress and how we're developing in, is basically having a virtual hub whereby the publishers can work together, and also third parties like AI companies and people that are specialized in screening material basically can come together to screen content and have trusted algorithms, ensuring that information that is submitted and published by articles is of high quality and is fully checked. So with that promise, I want to leave this presentation. I hope it gave you a good idea of the projects we're doing, but also in general, the mission we have. We see trusted research as extremely important. It is more and more important, it became more and more important in recent years. And it's really our mission to support that, working with many actors in the ecosystem, and with a special focus again on collaboration and on technology. So thank you.